Gary Wilson threw this change on the floor and pointed at the man in the worn jacket. "Get on your knees,"
Get
he
on your
said.
knees.
"Pick it up."
Pick it up.
The restaurant went silent. Maxwell Owens tightened his grip on his wallet, the one with his 9-year-old son's photo tucked inside, but he did not bend down. He simply lifted his phone, made one short call, then pulled out a chair and sat. Gary laughed under his breath, certain he had just handled another broke father causing trouble. Minutes later, the front door swung open. Every single person in that restaurant froze where they stood. Who had just walked in? Before we rewind to where it all began, if stories like this one keep you hooked until the very last second, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. New stories drop every week and you won't want to miss the next one. Now let's go back to the beginning of that night. The parking lot outside Magnolia Grill was already half full when Maxwell Owens pulled his 10-year-old Honda into a spot near the back. He sat there for a moment with the engine off, looking at the restaurant through the windshield. Buckhead at this hour looked like money, and Magnolia Grill looked like the kind of place where a single dinner could cost more than some people made in a day. He was not wearing a suit tonight, and he was not driving the Mercedes that usually carried him into rooms like this one. He had on a worn canvas jacket, a pair of work boots that had seen better winters, and a plain cap with no logo on it at all. His phone rang before he could get out of the car, and he smiled when he saw the name on the screen. Noah's voice came through bright and a little rushed, the way it always did when homework was finished early and dinner was the next thing on his mind. The boy wanted to know if his father would make it home in time to eat together, and Maxwell told him he would try his best, that he had one more stop to make first. When Noah asked if the pecan pie at this new restaurant was really as good as everyone said, Maxwell laughed and promised to bring a slice home if it was. Noah's response came fast and firm, the kind of instruction only a 9-year-old could deliver with total confidence. "Don't forget Dad." Maxwell ended the call and sat with the phone in his palm for a few seconds longer than he needed to. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, the leather soft and cracked from years of use, and opened it to the photograph tucked behind his license. Noah, in his baseball uniform, grinning with a gap where his front tooth used to be, and on the back in handwriting that still leaned too far to the right. The boy had written a single sentence months ago that Maxwell had never taken out. "Dad, you always tell me everyone matters." He had read those words more times than he could count, and every time they reminded him of a promise he made 4 years ago, standing beside a hospital bed to raise his son the way his mother would have wanted. Rachel had believed that character was the only currency that mattered, and Maxwell had spent every day since trying to prove she was right. Tonight was not really about dinner. 3 days earlier, Maxwell had signed the final paperwork on a deal worth $60 million, acquiring a chain of 31 restaurants across the Southeast, and Magnolia Grill was one of the crown jewels of that portfolio. The press conference announcing the sale was scheduled for Friday, and until then, not a single employee inside that building knew who actually owned the walls around them. Maxwell had learned a long time ago that the truest version of any company revealed itself not in boardrooms or investor calls, but in how it treated the people who seemed to have no power at all. So he had left the Mercedes at home, left the watch in its case, and walked in tonight looking like exactly what most of Buckhead would assume he could never be the owner. The hostess stand near the entrance was empty when he stepped inside, and the young woman working the front counter looked up with a smile that seemed genuine rather than rehearsed. Her name tag read Denise, and she had the kind of careful warmth that came from someone who had learned to read a room before she spoke in it. Maxwell asked for a coffee and a slice of pecan pie, and when he mentioned he might want a second slice packed to go for his son, her whole face warmed even further. She told him she would pick the best piece in the case, and for a moment the whole evening felt like nothing more than a quiet stop on the way home. That was when a man in a pressed shirt and a manager's badge came around the corner, moving with the kind of certainty that suggested he owned every square foot of the place himself. His eyes moved over Maxwell, slowly starting at the work boots and climbing up to the plain jacket, and whatever conclusion he reached hardened visibly into his posture. Before Denise could finish ringing up the order, he reached past her and pulled the $20 bill straight out of her hand, holding it up to the light like he was inspecting evidence. His name tag read, Gary Wilson, and the way he said the name of the restaurant made it sound like a private club Maxwell had wandered into by mistake. Gary asked, without much interest in the answer, whether Maxwell actually had money to be in a place like this, or whether he had just walked in looking for a free plate. Maxwell answered evenly, telling him the bill was real and that all he wanted was coffee pie and a second slice to bring home to his son. Gary turned the 20 over in his fingers, then called for a counterfeit pen, telling Denise it was better to be careful with people who walked in looking the way this one did. The bill was perfectly legitimate, and everyone behind that counter seemed to know it. But Gary kept talking anyway, suggesting out loud that men like Maxwell sometimes tried to pass bad money or start trouble, hoping another customer would cover the tab out of pity or lean on a story about a struggling single father to get something for nothing. Maxwell did not raise his voice or argue the point. He watched instead the way he watched everything when he wanted to understand a place rather than simply pass through it. Denise kept her eyes down on the counter, her hands moving faster than they needed to. A security guard near the door, a heavy-set man whose name tag read Marshall, shifted his weight, but said nothing at all. 2 tables nearby had gone quiet enough that their conversation seemed to have paused entirely, yet no one at either table looked up or said a word on Maxwell's behalf. In that silence, Maxwell understood that whatever was happening here was not new, and it was not really about him. The counterfeit pen came back clean, as everyone already knew it would, but Gary did not apologize or hand back the change with any more courtesy than before. Instead, when he finally counted out what Maxwell was owed, he set $7 on the counter and turned as if the transaction were finished. Maxwell looked at the bills without picking them up and pointed out calmly that $8.50 from a 20 came to $11.50, not 7. Gary's expression shifted instantly, and he accused Maxwell of trying to squeeze a few extra dollars out of the register by starting an argument over pocket change, adding that the customers who ordered the cheapest items on the menu were usually the ones who caused the most trouble before the night was over. Denise found her voice, then quiet but clear, confirming that Maxwell's math was correct, and that the register had simply been counted wrong. Gary turned on her immediately, warning her that he could write her up for the shift and cut her hours if she kept contradicting him in front of customers. Maxwell watched the fear move across her face quick, and practiced the kind of fear that came from having heard that threat before and knowing exactly how real it was. He understood in that moment that Gary had built this behavior into a habit, and that everyone working under him had learned long ago that silence was the safer choice. Gary called Marshall over next, telling him to keep an eye on the man by the counter as though Maxwell had done anything more than ask for the correct change. As Marshall took a few steps closer, Maxwell's phone buzzed once in his pocket, and he glanced down to see a voice message from Noah waiting on the screen, a short reminder about the pie that made him almost smile despite everything unfolding around him. For a few seconds, he considered simply walking out, calling his head of human resources from the car, and having Gary removed from the company before the night was over. It would have been easy, and it would have been justified, and it would have solved exactly nothing beyond this one moment. If he left now, Maxwell realized he would only ever know what he had personally witnessed. One manager overcharging one customer on one ordinary evening. He would never know how far Gary was willing to go with someone he believed had no power to push back, no lawyer, no title, no name that meant anything inside this building. That question mattered more to Maxwell than the $11.50 sitting untouched on the counter, and it mattered more than his own comfort in the moment. He sent a quick text to the babysitter watching Noah, letting her know he would be later than planned, then asked Denise as casually as he could manage for Gary's full name for a comment card he intended to fill out later. With that answer in hand, Maxwell carried his coffee and his pie to a small table near the back of the dining room, away from the counter and close enough to the kitchen doors to see most of the restaurant floor. He set his wallet on the table beside his cup, the photograph of Noah still tucked where it always was, and settled into the chair like a man with nowhere else to be. Gary glanced his way once, seemingly satisfied that the confrontation was over, and turned back to the register as though nothing worth remembering had happened at all. Maxwell knew otherwise. He had made his decision the moment he asked for that name, and there would be no walking back from it now. From where he sat, Maxwell could watch the whole rhythm of the dining room without appearing to watch anything at all. Servers moved between tables with trays balanced on their forearms. A hostess seated a party of 4 near the window, and somewhere behind the swinging kitchen doors, a bell rang twice to signal an order ready for pickup. It was on the surface an ordinary Tuesday night at a restaurant doing exactly what it was built to do. Only the small cluster of tension near the front counter suggested otherwise, and Maxwell understood that most of the people in this room had no idea it was even there. I thought about the 30 other restaurants now carrying his name on paperwork none of their staff had seen, and about Noah waiting at home with a homework folder and a question about pie. Both of those things felt far away from the plastic chair he was sitting in, and yet both of them were the reason he had chosen to stay rather than leave. A business he had told Noah more than once was really just a collection of small moments like this one repeated 1,000 times a day in places the owner would never think to visit. Tonight he intended to see one of those moments through to whatever it became. 12 minutes passed with Maxwell doing nothing more than drinking his coffee slowly and working through the pecan pie in small bites. From his table near the kitchen doors, he could see Gary glancing over every few minutes, then leaning close to Marshall to say something too quiet to hear. Twice, Gary sent Denise back to the storage room to check whether anything on the shelves had gone missing, though nothing about the evening had given her any reason to look. Maxwell recognized the pattern for what it was, a manager building a case against a man who had done nothing except point out an error in his own change. The dining room around him carried on as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Servers refilling water glasses and a family 2 tables over debating dessert options in low, contented voices. Maxwell found something almost unbearable in that ordinariness. The way an entire room could keep functioning normally while one corner of it quietly built toward something ugly. He was not in a hurry. He had learned patience the same way he had learned most things worth knowing, by watching people who did not know they were being watched, and Gary was giving him more information with every passing minute than any employee survey ever could. I thought briefly about the 30 other restaurants in this new portfolio, wondering how many of them had their own version of Gary, standing behind a counter somewhere confident that no one above them would ever find out. It was one thing to read a compliance report full of numbers and percentages. It was another thing entirely to sit in a corner booth and watch the exact shape of the problem unfold in real time, coin by coin, insult by insult, until there was no explaining it away as an isolated incident. When Maxwell finally stood and carried his empty plate and cup back toward the counter, Gary stepped directly into his path before he reached it. There was no pretense of courtesy left in his voice now, only the flat certainty of a man convinced he had caught something. "I saw you on that phone more than once," Gary said, crossing his arms. "Taking pictures of the exits, the cameras. People like you come in, scope the place out, and come back later when nobody's watching." Maxwell told him plainly that he had done no such thing, that his phone had been used only to check a message from his son. Gary was no longer interested in explanations, waving off the answer before Maxwell had even finished giving it, as though the accusation itself had already settled the matter in his mind. Instead, Gary demanded that Maxwell empty every pocket onto the counter so the staff could see for themselves that nothing had been taken. Maxwell asked evenly what exactly Gary believed was missing, since no one had reported anything out of place and no alarm of any kind had sounded. Gary answered that he did not need a specific item in mind to know when something felt wrong about a customer, and that experience in this business taught a manager to trust his instincts before a situation got out of hand. Maxwell recognized the phrase for what it was, a way of dressing up a decision that had already been made the moment he walked through the door in his work boots. Marshall shifted uncomfortably at the edge of the exchange, and for a moment it looked as though he might object, aware that nothing about this request had any real basis. He had worked security at Magnolia Grill long enough to know the difference between a genuine concern and a manager looking for an excuse, and everything about tonight told him this fell into the second category. But when Gary snapped his name and told him to help make sure the man complied, Marshall stepped forward anyway, his discomfort losing out to the habit of doing what he was told. the same habit that had kept him quiet through every uncomfortable moment before this one. Maxwell studied Gary's face for a long moment, then decided the fastest way to see exactly how far this would go was simply to let it happen. He reached into his jacket and set his keys down. First, the worn fob for the Honda landing with a small metallic click. Next came his wallet, followed by his phone, and then folded into a tight square in his inside pocket. The signed agreement for the $60 million acquisition, the paper that would have ended this entire encounter the moment anyone thought to unfold it. Last of all, a small plastic toy fell out onto the counter, something Noah had left in his father's pocket days earlier, and that Maxwell had never gotten around to returning to the toy bin at home. It was a small, ordinary object, a plastic dinosaur missing one leg, but seeing it there under the restaurant lights made something tighten in Maxwell's chest. He thought of Noah pressing it into his hand that morning, asking his father to keep it safe for him during the day, the way he always did before school. Gary glanced at it briefly, decided it was of no interest, and turned his attention to the folded paper instead, though he did not bother to open it. He simply pushed it aside with 2 fingers, apparently more interested in appearances than in anything that might actually explain who Maxwell was. Gary picked up the wallet without asking permission, and opened it the way a man might open something he already considered evidence. The photograph of Noah slid loose and landed face up on the counter between them, the boy's gap-toothed grin catching the light. Gary looked down at it, and something like amusement crossed his face before he said almost lazily that men carried pictures like that around to make people feel sorry for them when they could not afford their own bill. Maxwell told him with as much control as he could manage to put the photograph down and leave it alone. Gary did not put it down right away. He held it a second longer than necessary, turning it slightly as though inspecting a prop, and asked whether this was the same boy Maxwell had mentioned earlier, the one waiting at home for pie. When Maxwell confirmed it was, Gary added that a real father would work hard enough that his son never had to be embarrassed by the way he looked walking into a restaurant. He said it lightly, almost as an aside, the way a man might comment on the weather, and that carelessness made the words land even harder than if he had shouted them. That was the first moment all evening that reached somewhere deeper in Maxwell than irritation or curiosity. This was no longer only about a manager mishandling change or accusing a stranger of theft. Now it was personal, aimed directly at the promise Maxwell had made beside Rachel's hospital bed 4 years earlier, the promise this very photograph represented. Still, Maxwell did not raise his voice, and he did not give Gary the name that would have ended everything in an instant. He simply held out his hand, palm up, and waited until Gary finally set the photograph back down on the counter. Nothing on the counter turned up anything worth finding, not a stolen fork, not a missing dessert, nothing at all to justify what had just happened. A few nearby tables had gone quiet by now, drawn by the sight of a grown man emptying his pockets under a manager's watch, and the low murmur of conversation across the dining room had thinned into something more like held breath. Gary seemed to sense the shift in attention, and rather than let the moment pass with the apology it clearly called for, he straightened as though preparing to make an example of something. Rather than offer any kind of apology, Gary reached into the register drawer and pulled out the $11.50 still owed from earlier, this time in loose coins rather than bills. He gathered a fistful of quarters and dimes, closed his hand around them until his knuckles went pale, and looked directly at Maxwell as he opened his fingers and let the coins fall. "There's your change," Gary said. "Pick it up." The coins scattered loudly across the tile floor, one rolling beneath a nearby chair, another striking the toe of a customer's shoe before coming to rest. The sound seemed to freeze the entire dining room for a moment, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned toward the counter. The photograph of Noah, still lying where Gary had left it, slipped off the edge of the counter and landed among the scattered coins on the floor. Gary pointed down at the mess he had just created. "Get on your knees," he said. "Pick it up. Might do your boy some good to see what happens to people who forget their place." This was the moment the entire evening pivoted on, though nothing in the room looked especially different from one second to the next. Until now, Maxwell had been quietly observing a business he owned, gathering the kind of information no boardroom report could ever give him. Now he was standing in the middle of a deliberate attempt to strip a man of his dignity in front of a room full of strangers, and the man being stripped of it happened to be him. For half a second, something old and heavy rose in Maxwell's chest. A memory of every room in his life where someone had looked at him and decided before a single word was spoken exactly what he was worth. He thought of Rachel, of the promise he had made her, and of Noah's handwriting on the back of that photograph, now lying in a scatter of quarters and dimes. Maxwell walked forward, but not to kneel. He bent down only far enough to lift the photograph from among the coins, brushing it gently against his sleeve before returning it to his wallet, then straightened to his full height and looked directly at Gary. "Who is your regional manager?" he asked, his voice even and unhurried, carrying none of the anger the moment would have justified. Around them, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath in different ways. Denise had turned toward the wall, one hand pressed against her mouth, tears clearly building even as she tried to hide them. Marshall took a step back, his shame written plainly across his face, though he still said nothing. A few customers lifted their phones and began recording, capturing the scene, rather than intervening in it, while one couple near the window quietly gathered their things and slipped toward the exit without a word to anyone. A young woman seated alone near the register, still dressed in a set of pale blue scrubs from what looked like a long shift, kept her phone raised steadily, her expression tight with something closer to anger than curiosity. The rest simply sat where they were watching, and Maxwell understood in that instant that the deeper problem in this restaurant was never only Gary. It was every person who could see something wrong happening and chose again and again to look away instead of standing up. He did not blame any one of them individually. He recognized better than most how easily fear could talk a good person into silence, and he suspected that more than a few of the phones now pointed at him belonged to people who genuinely wished they were doing something braver. Gary laughed at the question, a short, humorless sound, and told Maxwell with total confidence that the regional manager, a woman named Patricia Davis, would never take the word of a man dressed the way he was over that of a manager with 6 years of loyal service. He added that Patricia trusted him completely, that he had built a reputation with corporate over the years that a stranger off the street could not undo with one phone call. Maxwell asked him quietly whether he was certain about that, and something in the steadiness of the question, so unlike the reaction Gary had expected, seemed to catch him off guard for the first time all evening. Maxwell said nothing further in response to the insult. He simply lifted his phone from among his belongings, still spread across the counter, found a number, and made a short call. When the line connected, his words were brief and unmistakably calm. "Patricia, it's Maxwell. Get to Magnolia Grill now." Gary assumed or wanted to assume that this was nothing more than a desperate bluff, a man inventing a connection to corporate leadership he did not actually have. He told Marshall to escort Maxwell out of the building immediately, but for the first time all night, Marshall did not move right away. Something in the way Maxwell had spoken on that call, quiet and certain rather than pleading, seemed to give the security guard pause, though he still could not bring himself to openly defy his manager. "Marshall," Gary said again, sharper this time, "get him out." Marshall took one hesitant step forward and stopped, glancing between Gary and Maxwell as though searching for some version of this moment that did not require him to choose a side. Gary's frustration boiled over into something sharper when the guard failed to move any further, and he announced that he would call the police himself if Maxwell refused to leave voluntarily. "Maybe while we wait for the police," Gary added with a cruelty that landed harder than anything he had said all night. "You can explain to your son why his father got dragged out of a nice restaurant in handcuffs." That single sentence found the one place in Maxwell that all the earlier insults had not quite reached. He was not afraid of losing his reputation in this room, and he was not afraid of whatever story Gary might try to tell the police when they arrived. What he feared, the only thing that truly frightened him in that moment, was the picture of Noah someday hearing that his father had been dragged out of a restaurant simply because of the color of his skin and the clothes he had chosen to wear that evening. And yet Maxwell also understood something else, something that had been building in him since the moment Gary first snatched the $20 bill out of Denise's hand. If he walked away now simply to protect his own comfort or spare himself an uncomfortable scene, then the next father who walked through that door without power, without a lawyer, without a name, anyone recognized would face this exact same treatment with no one standing behind him at all. Maxwell picked his wallet and his keys back up from the counter, pulled out a chair at the nearest empty table, and sat down deliberately. "I'll wait," he said. Gary took that as defiance rather than resolve, and he pulled out his own phone, dialing the number for the local police department while making sure Maxwell could hear every word of it. Maxwell sat with his hands folded on the table, the coins still scattered across the floor a few feet away, the photograph of Noah safely back in his wallet where it belonged. Around him, nothing changed. The customers with their phones raised kept recording, capturing footage rather than offering help. Marshall stood near the door, clearly torn, but still unwilling to challenge the man who signed his schedule. Denise wiped her eyes at the counter, aware that speaking up again tonight could cost her the job she badly needed. The minutes that followed stretched longer than the 12 Maxwell had already spent watching Gary from across the room. A young couple near the window kept their eyes fixed on their plates, occasionally glancing up before looking away again, and Maxwell understood that some part of them wanted to say something and simply could not find the courage to do it. A man at the bar lowered his phone, once opened his mouth as though about to speak, and then closed it again when Gary shot a look in his direction. Nobody in Magnolia Grill was cruel by nature, Maxwell thought, but cruelty had never needed a majority to succeed. It only needed enough people willing to stay quiet, and tonight this room had more than enough. Maxwell played Noah's voicemail again under the table, the volume low enough that only he could hear it, the boy's voice small and cheerful and completely unaware of anything happening 200 miles from his own bedtime routine. Listening to it steadied him in a way nothing else in the room could. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, whether the police arrived first or Patricia did, he intended to walk out of this building still able to look his son in the eye and tell him the truth about how his father had behaved when no one seemed willing to stand beside him. Behind the counter, Denise kept glancing toward Maxwell with an expression that had shifted since earlier in the evening, looking less like pity now and more like something quietly resolving itself. She had already given her honest account once tonight and paid for it with a threat against her hours, and she seemed to be deciding in the privacy of her own thoughts whether she had the nerve to do it again if the police actually walked through that door and asked her what she had seen. Maxwell caught her eye once briefly and gave the smallest nod, not asking anything of her, only letting her know that whatever she chose to do or not do in the next few minutes, he did not hold it against her. In the strictest sense, Maxwell held more power than anyone else in that building. He owned the deed to the walls around him, the equipment behind the counter, and technically the paycheck that put food on Gary's table every 2 weeks. Yet in this precise moment, none of that mattered at all because nobody in the room knew it, and he had chosen not to tell them. He was, for all anyone in Magnolia Grill could see exactly what Gary had decided, he was the moment he walked through the door. A poor father about to be led away by police in front of strangers who would do nothing but watch. Maxwell reached for his wallet one more time and looked again at the photograph of his son, at the words written across the back in a child's careful handwriting. He thought of something he told Noah often, usually after a hard day when doing the right thing had cost him something. Being right does not stop being right just because you have to stand alone while you are it. He wondered sitting there what he would say to Noah if the boy ever asked him about this night, and he found that he already knew the answer. He would tell him the truth, all of it, including the part where nobody in the room had stood up until they had no choice. Sitting there waiting for a call to the police to finish, Maxwell understood with total clarity that firing Gary alone would never be enough. Something in the structure surrounding him, the silence he had built into his staff, the fear he had trained into every person working under him needed to be dismantled entirely, not patched over. A single termination would fix tonight. It would do nothing at all for the next father who walked through a different set of doors wearing the wrong jacket in front of the wrong manager. Just as Gary was finishing his call, headlights swept briefly across the front windows, sliding over the glass and across the tables nearest the entrance. Every head in the dining room turned at once, drawn by the sudden motion outside, and even Gary paused mid-sentence to glance toward the door. A black SUV pulled to a stop directly outside, close enough to the curb that it was clearly not looking for a parking spot, its engine still running as the doors began to open. The driver's door opened almost before the vehicle had fully stopped, and a woman stepped out with the kind of urgency that suggested she had left wherever she had been the moment she got the call. Her blazer was still half-buttoned, as though she had finished dressing in the car, and she moved across the parking lot at a pace just short of a run. Behind her, a second door opened, and a man in a dark suit followed close behind, a leather folder tucked under one arm, moving with the same hurried focus. Whatever conversation had been happening in hushed tones around the dining room fell away entirely, replaced by a silence that felt different from the one Gary had been enforcing all night, sharper somehow and full of a tension nobody in the room could yet explain. Even the young woman in scrubs lowered her phone slightly, sensing that whatever was about to happen mattered more than anything her camera had captured so far. Gary straightened his collar and adjusted his tie, a small, satisfied smile forming at the corner of his mouth. He clearly believed Patricia Davis had arrived to handle the unruly customer causing problems at his counter, and he stepped forward to meet her at the door, already preparing whatever explanation he intended to give. "Patricia, thank you for coming so quickly." Gary began, his voice suddenly smoother than it had been all evening. "We've had a bit of a situation with a customer who—" Patricia walked straight past him without so much as a glance in his direction, her eyes fixed instead on the man sitting quietly at the table near the back of the dining room. Whatever Gary had been about to say died somewhere in his throat as he watched her stride right past him as though he were nothing more than part of the furniture. The man in the dark suit followed a step behind her, his eyes moving briefly over the scattered coins still visible near the counter, and something in his expression suggested he was already taking careful note of everything he saw without needing to write a single word of it down. Denise straightened at the counter, wiping quickly at her eyes as Patricia passed, and Marshall went still near the door, watching the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between relief and dread. Neither of them said a word, and neither of them looked away, as though some instinct told them this moment deserved to be witnessed all the way through. Patricia crossed the floor quickly, stopped in front of Maxwell, and bowed her head slightly before she spoke, her voice carrying just far enough for the nearest tables to hear every word. "Mr. Owens, I am so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." For a moment, nobody moved at all. Gary stood frozen near the door with his phone still in his hand, the call to the police forgotten mid-dial, his mouth slightly open as though the sentence Patricia had just spoken refused to make sense, no matter how many times his mind turned it over. Denise's hand slipped from her mouth. Marshall's eyes went wide, and something like disbelief passed openly across his face. Somewhere near the register, the young woman in scrubs lifted her phone again, this time with the unmistakable instinct that whatever came next was the part worth keeping. The entire restaurant went completely still. Gary could not understand why Patricia had just addressed the man in the worn canvas jacket as Mr. Owens, a name that belonged nowhere near someone he had spent the last half hour treating like a threat to the business rather than a paying customer. Patricia turned from Maxwell to face the room, her voice carrying clearly enough for every table, every server, and every phone still recording to catch every word. She introduced Maxwell Owens as the founder and chief executive of Owens Hospitality Group, and as the new owner of Magnolia Grill and the 30 other restaurants in the chain following a $60 million acquisition finalized 3 days earlier. The dining room fell into a silence deeper than any that had come before it that night. Gary looked from the worn jacket to the work boots to the keys for the 10-year-old Honda still sitting on the counter, then down at the coins he himself had thrown across the floor less than an hour ago. He was looking for the first time all evening at exactly the man he had spent the last hour humiliating, and the weight of that recognition seemed to drain the color from his face all at once. Somewhere behind him, the young woman in scrubs lowered her phone just enough to watch the scene unfold with her own eyes instead of through a screen. Maxwell unfolded the paper Gary had pushed aside without ever opening it, revealing the restaurant's name, the acquisition figures and his own signature at the bottom of the final page. Patricia asked Gary directly whether he had checked a legitimate bill for counterfeiting shorted a customer's change demanded. He emptied his pockets thrown coins across the floor and directed discriminatory remarks at a father in front of his own son's photograph. Gary could not deny any of it. Too many phones in the room had already captured every second. His tone shifted instantly, and he began addressing Maxwell as Sir, insisting he had no way of knowing who he was speaking to. Something almost pleading crept into his voice now, the very same voice that had ordered Maxwell to his knees on the floor only minutes before. Maxwell answered him without raising his voice, the same steady tone he had carried through the entire evening. "That's exactly the problem," he said. I explained without any anger left in his tone that if Gary had known who he was from the beginning, he would have smiled, pulled out a chair, and served him with every courtesy in the book. But the next black father who walked through that door in a worn jacket with no title and no name that meant anything to Gary would receive exactly the same treatment Maxwell had received tonight. "You didn't insult the wrong owner," Maxwell told him, his voice still calm. "You deliberately humiliated someone you believed had no power to stop you." Gary apologized again, mentioning his 6 years with the company, as though loyalty alone might undo what had already happened. But Maxwell looked down at the coins still scattered near his feet before answering. "You're not sorry for what you did," he said. "You're only sorry it happened to be me." Patricia moved quickly once the truth of the evening had settled over the room, her earlier urgency now sharpened into something closer to authority. She instructed Gary to surrender his keys, his access badge, his manager credentials, and his company phone on the spot, informing him he was suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Marshall, who only minutes earlier had been ordered to escort Maxwell out of the building, was the one who walked Gary to the door instead, a reversal neither man could have predicted at the start of the night. Before Gary left, Maxwell reached into his own pocket, found a single quarter and set it down beside the manager badge Gary had just handed over, leaving the scattered coins on the floor exactly where they had fallen. "Throwing money at a human being and ordering them to kneel isn't a misunderstanding," Maxwell said. "It's a choice." Once Gary was gone, Maxwell spoke privately with Marshall, acknowledging that his hesitation earlier in the night meant he had known on some level that the order he was following was wrong. That hesitation, Maxwell told him, was worth something even if it had not been enough. Still, Marshall had moved toward an innocent man anyway twice, because a badge on someone else's shirt had told him to. Maxwell did not fire him outright. Instead, Marshall was suspended from active security duties required to complete new training and placed under a formal review period before returning to work. "A wrong order doesn't become right just because the person giving it wears a manager's badge," Maxwell told him. Denise received a very different conversation. Maxwell thanked her for confirming the truth about his change, even after Gary threatened her hours for it, and he acknowledged plainly that no employee should have to choose between honesty and a paycheck. She was guaranteed protection from any retaliation, and after a formal review, she was promoted to assistant manager, a title she would carry the next time Maxwell walked back through those doors, and one she had earned the moment she chose to speak the truth out loud instead of staying silent like everyone else in the room. Maxwell knelt down one final time and gathered the coins himself, this time on his own terms, rather than Gary's. He picked up each one slowly, unhurried, nothing like the demand that had been made of him earlier that night. He dropped the full $11.50 into the tip jar by the register. "This belongs to the people who actually work for it," he said, setting the jar back where it belonged. The young woman in scrubs who had filmed nearly the entire encounter, a 23-year-old nursing student finishing a long shift before dinner, posted her footage online later that night without expecting more than a handful of views from friends. It ran from the moment Gary held the $20 bill up to the light all the way through Patricia calling Maxwell by name, and it spread faster than anyone at Magnolia Grill could have predicted. Within hours, strangers across the country were watching the same 11 minutes of footage on repeat. The line "Pick it up" became the most shared moment from the clip, and the hashtag #PickItUpJustice began trending within a day, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of being judged for their skin, their clothes, their jobs, or their circumstances. The attention drew the notice of a local reporter named Megan Taylor, who reached out to the company requesting comment on the footage that was already circulating everywhere. In speaking with her, Maxwell learned that Gary had been the subject of at least 3 prior discrimination complaints, every one of them buried or marked resolved by a former regional manager named Phil Keaton, a man who had shielded Gary from consequences for years because of their friendship. Maxwell ordered an internal investigation that same night. Gary was terminated for discrimination, customer harassment, and abuse of authority. Phil Keaton was terminated as well for concealing complaints and falsifying internal records. The 3 earlier victims were contacted, given a genuine apology, and compensated for what they had endured. Magnolia Grill closed for 2 weeks while Maxwell rebuilt the culture that had allowed Gary to operate unchecked for so long. Standing before his management teams from all 31 locations, he laid out 2 changes he considered non-negotiable changes that had been forming in his mind from the moment he sat waiting for the police to arrive earlier that same night. Every complaint would now go directly to an independent review board, stripping local managers of any ability to bury or dismiss a report the way Phil Keaton once had. And every manager, he told them, would be held accountable, not only for what they did themselves, but for the culture of silence they allowed to grow underneath them. The rest of the reforms followed in the weeks after that first meeting. A 12-week training program on bias and de-escalation, quarterly audits of the customer experience across every location, and a small dignity commitment plaque installed near the entrance of each restaurant. Maxwell made clear to everyone involved that none of it existed because he happened to be the one holding the title of chief executive. It existed for the next father who might walk through a set of doors with no lawyer, no title, and no regional manager racing across town to make things right. 6 weeks later, Maxwell pulled the same Honda into the same parking lot. Only this time Noah sat in the passenger seat beside him, still in his simple baseball shirt, kicking his feet against the seat in anticipation of the pie he had been promised for weeks. Neither of them had told anyone they were coming. A new host greeted them warmly at the door, glancing at neither the worn jacket nor the car parked outside, and Denise, now wearing a tag that read assistant manager, smiled the moment she recognized them both, waving them toward their usual table near the back, as though they had never stopped coming at all. Noah ordered chocolate milk. Maxwell ordered coffee, and the 2 of them split the slice of pecan pie Maxwell had promised weeks earlier and never quite delivered. Noah noticed the old tip jar full of coins near the register and asked why Denise still kept it there. Maxwell told him simply that someone had once thrown those coins on the floor to humiliate another person. "Did you pick them up?" Noah asked. "I did," Maxwell said quietly. "But only after that person didn't have the power to order me around anymore." Noah sat quietly for a moment, turning that answer over in his head, the way he did whenever his father gave him something to think about, rather than a simple answer, then asked why nobody else in the restaurant had helped that night. Maxwell looked around the room before answering, taking his time with the question the way he always did when Noah asked something that mattered. "Sometimes good people stay quiet simply because they're scared," he said. "But if everyone stays quiet, the person doing wrong starts to believe they were right." When the bill came, Maxwell handed Noah a $20 bill and let him pay for both of them himself. Denise counted the change carefully and placed it into the boy's open hand, folding his small fingers gently around the bills, the way she might have once wished someone had done for the man sitting quietly across the table from him on a night that had started very differently. "If you ever saw someone treated like that," Maxwell asked his son, "what would you do?" "I'd stand up," Noah said. They walked out together past a new bronze plaque mounted beside the door that read, "Every guest who walks through this door deserves to be treated with dignity." Maxwell rested a hand on his son's shoulder as they crossed the lot toward the old Honda, waiting under the streetlight, the same car that had carried him into this restaurant 6 weeks earlier as a stranger. Nobody thought worth their respect. If you had been sitting in that restaurant watching a father ordered to kneel and pick coins up off the floor, would you have stood up for him? Or would you have simply raised your phone and kept your silence like everyone else? That's the question this story leaves behind, and it's worth sitting with long after the video ends. If it made you think about someone you might have walked past today, do them a favor and share it with someone who needs the reminder. And if you want more stories about quiet strength and the courage it takes to stand up for someone else, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.